The Netflix CEO says that the main competitor to Netflix is sleep. And the internet doesn't turn off at any point. So if we're marinating in this online environment, which is about infinity in a way, no limit, how can we be pro-limit in that kind of environment, or is resistance futile?
I think what I'm really doing is not saying we should live in a certain way, but just sort of pointing out that certain things are facts about us, right? So the limits that I harp on about are the limits that we just do have as humans, kind of whether we are conscious of them or not.
This is Life and Faith, a podcast where we explore different conversations about religion with a capital R by talking with people about human experiences, ideas and loves. We believe that conversations stressing human things evoke, in the end, deeply religious questions, that all things tap, ultimately, into matters of life and faith. Welcome to Life and Faith from CPX. I'm Simon Smart.
And I'm Justine Toe.
How are you going at time management? There's always plenty of things to be getting on with, and many people, I'd include myself in this, feel inundated constantly, which is why productivity tips and hacks are big business these days. It feels completely normal to feel continually pressed for time and to feel like the weeks are whipping by. Blink and it's Friday, Justine.
Yeah, I know.
You're feeling it today,
Yep,
are you?
all the time. In the spirit of today's interview, I actually counted how many weeks that we've had so far in 2025. It's been 22, which seems like a lot, but also hasn't felt like it's been very long.
No, and if you'd asked me to guess, I reckon I would have said about 15 or so since the year began. It's alarming. It'll be Christmas, Justine, before you know it. And all I can think of are the things that I said I'd get done this year. And you must be feeling this a bit too, because you're going on long service leave later this year. That's
Yes.
something to look forward to, but, pressure as well.
I am looking forward to it. But yeah, I feel like I said I'd do all these things and will I get them done? And I do not know, right? And anyone with a deadline is going to understand that feeling of feeling hounded by the clock constantly. I think this is the resting state of modern life, which is ironic, right? Because the resting state is like a furious pace all the time. But it is good to remember, and I'm really glad our guest today does this, is he reminds us that time pressure hasn't always been the case. So, yeah, I love that reminder.
Yeah, does he therefore have the answer to solve all our problems with time? Tell us about Oliver Burkeman.
Yeah, I think his approach is more of a knowledge is power kind of thing. So he just wants us to see that underneath our time problem, our productivity problem, is a reality that many of us don't want to face, right? The reality that we're going to die.
Gee. So Oliver Burkeman's book is 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals. So that's where the 4,000 weeks comes in. Is he just teaching us to number our days?
Yeah, that's right. So he gets that number, 4,000 weeks, from the fact that the span of an average lifetime, 80 years, is about 4,000 weeks. And I know what you're thinking now, like, let's not worry about how many weeks we have left.
I was wondering.
But Oliver Burkeman, he used to write this long-running column in The Guardian that I used to love reading all the time. It was called This Column Will Change Your Life. And it always felt like a friendly chat with, your really clever friend who's read all the books and is happy to distill them for you. Oliver describes himself as a recovering productivity geek. He's from the UK and he's written several books, the latest being 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals, which is what we're talking about. And that came out in 2021. And also Meditations for Mortals, which is like a workbook that goes alongside 4,000 Weeks.
So, how did mortality end up becoming his approach? Here's Oliver Burkeman.
What I like about that subtitle is just the idea that it sort of implies in its grammar that it's telling you the niche audience for whom this book is focused, but then that niche audience is just everyone who dies. So it's not very niche at all. The realization that I came to over sort of years of trying to kind of get my life under control and get on top of everything and handle all the demands and all the normal challenges we all face was that a certain kind of avoidance of my finitude, of my limited state, was the key to everything. And it's strange because, of course, everybody knows intellectually that they are limited and mortal and going to die and all these things. Just the fact that the time in a day is limited is well known to all of us, and then sort of ignored by all of us at 8 o'clock on a Monday morning when you're making your to-do list. And so I think what the book tries to do, and what lots of things I write try to do, is lead people into more of a felt experience of what it is to be limited and mortal. Again, because I've found that that's actually incredibly empowering and liberating in the end. It's sort of depressing and you need to accept defeat in a way at first, but it's very quickly a much more sort of empowering way to be looking reality in the face, as it were, and coming to terms with where you actually are.
I can imagine someone listening in might be like, how is it empowering to know that we're going to die and that we won't have all the time in the world? Maybe if you want to just give us a hint of why you find that empowering.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can say it in different ways, more practical and more sort of spiritual in a way. But I guess it is that once you begin to see what you're up to, when you're kind of trying to delude yourself, when you're sort of thinking that one more efficiency technique, a little bit more self-discipline, or a little bit more yelling internally at yourself will finally get you to the sort of beautiful plateau where everything is easy because you're on top of all the demands. When you see why that is never coming, essentially because the incoming supply of worthwhile things to do is unlimited and we are limited, when you sort of internalize that sense that the moment when you're on top of everything and in total control is never coming, it's actually permission to do the things that you care about now, even if imperfectly, and even if in that state of feeling like you'd rather have more control over how things unfold. So it's empowering in that sense. It's the switch from kind of perfect fantasies of the future state when everything's going to be great, being replaced by kind of the willingness to do things here and now in the world with other people. And so that's why it's good news.
I think what's haunting our discussion in a way is the fact that we feel a lot of pressure to do things with our time. Mm-hmm. And so we want to make the most of the time that we have. And it's very interesting because in the book, you give a religious backstory, I suppose, as to why that might be. You say that at one time, heaven or the afterlife used to compensate for any of the limitations of our earthly existence. But now, if there is no afterlife, suddenly we have this sense of overwhelm. It's on us to sort of make as much as we can, experience as much as we can with the limited time we've got. That's surely part of the picture too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the problem with sort of identifying the role of religious legacies in this is that, obviously, until a few hundred years ago, all philosophical and intellectual thought took place in the context of religion. So you can find strands of religious belief that make eternity a great solace for the pain of finitude. You can certainly find other strands that are in some ways the origin of that, or one of the origins of that pressure to produce and to work, to sort of earn your place or to demonstrate your place in the right bit of the afterlife.
The Protestant work ethic, you mean?
Right, absolutely, yeah. And then, extraordinary antidotes in the traditions of Sabbath and things like that to deal with the pressures of that. So it's all there in religious traditions. But yeah, I would think that, and I think there's plenty of reason to believe it, that the sense that this was not all there was would be some level of comfort. It might, in some ways, in its sort of worst form, it might allow a sort of evasion of responsibility for the use of the present moment and the sort of taking responsibility for the present moment. But yeah, it sort of suddenly all feels like it's all on us very, very much to make it worthwhile, with the added problem that it's not quite clear why any of it matters at all if it's happening in that context, right? The spectre of sort of nihilism is there as well.
Well, there's so much going on there. I think it sounds as though you're gesturing to the cosmic insignificance therapy, maybe. We'll come to that.
Sure.
And you've mentioned Sabbath as well. But I think, I want to get into this idea of conveyor belt time, just to sort of set the scene for us, because just me as an example, I'm a very cliched modern person. I'm very time poor. I am anxious to fit everything in whenever I can. I try and be efficient, all the rest of it. And family life in high-income countries is just warp speed, just living to the schedule week in, week out. So when you had this phrase, conveyor belt time, I was like, oh, that's exactly what's going on there. Can you just crack the door open a bit wider on that phrase for us? What does that mean? It just means what exactly?
Yeah, this essential idea, I mean, one way of putting it is that the whole notion of time as a kind of resource that you need to use, or something like a conveyor belt that sort of runs alongside you, right? Time is running by, there are boxes on the conveyor belt, you've got to do something with each box, you've got to make use of it, but it doesn't stop. And in fact, the faster you go, the faster it seems to accelerate. All of that is premised on this notion that there is you, and then there is like time. And it's separate from you, and it sort of exists alongside you, or it's something you've got to use. And I think that there's good reason to believe that that is really the idea that that's the only way of thinking about time is a sort of phenomenon of the industrial era and the invention of clocks and the existence of sort of objectively agreed times and all that sort of long phase of change. Because you can imagine another way, right? And anthropologists make this distinction. They talk about time-oriented societies like ours, but also task-oriented societies, primarily historically, where people would not even necessarily had the thought, or most people would not have had the thought, to consider time as something separate from them that they had to make the most use of, or that they felt hounded by, or that they could waste if they went about it wrongly. There wasn't that separation, right? You milk the cows when it's time to milk the cows. You harvest the crops when it's time to harvest the crops. And someone who came along and said, why don't you do like all the milking for the month in one day because you should batch your tasks, because I read it in a productivity book, right? This makes no sense. It's silly, but it's silly in a deep way because the flow of your existence doesn't admit of that. And I think we all do experience time in that sort of way that people sometimes refer to as kind of vertical. And it may be what some people in a religious context mean by eternal life as well, right? Not some sort of linear extension of our time off into the future, but something much more timeless in a present moment. And I think it's really useful to remember that the way we relate to time today is not the only way of doing it. Not because we can just opt out and live like medieval people, and nor would we want to in almost every way. But
well, we wouldn't want to live like medieval people, but if I think about it, our calendar is not just structured by conveyor belt time, but the retail calendar, because I can tell you when Black Friday is, when Cyber Monday is, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And it feels like we are crying out for some kind of alternative way of talking about time. And I found what you've just been describing, I think you call it deep time in the book. There was something really deep in me that really resonated with that. And you describe how prayer and meditation, but even toddlerhood as being an experience of deep time where there's just this intense stress on being rather than doing. And I think there's something really quite beautiful in that. And I know you've been to meditation retreats, and I think there's a passage in your book where you talk about how hiking might have this experience for you as well. I was wondering if you would share with us, do you have a deep time habit? Is it easy to just drop into that mode and then drop out of it again? How do you do it?
Yeah, I mean, it's not easy, but it does happen. I think it's very closely related to what people refer to as flow state in creative work, when one is lucky enough to have that happen. The hiking example is good because it really pinpoints something we haven't discussed yet, which is the way in which this conveyor belt approach to time intrinsically focuses you kind of out of the present moment and onto the future. And it leads to this sort of fundamental understanding of what you're doing in life as trying to get somewhere, and very possibly trying to get the present moment out of the way so that you can get to the future one. This idea that an action you take in time is fundamentally to be measured by where it's taking you only. And of course, we all have to do that all the time to get anything done, and it's always been that way. But there's a sort of extreme that you can reach with that, where you've sort of abandoned any thought that the present moment is a meaningful experience too. And so hiking is a good example of what Kieran Setia, the philosopher, calls an atelic activity. It's not something you do in order to get a certain amount of it done or in order to reach a certain point or place. When you hike in a loop, the most efficient way to do it is just not to go on the hike at all. But people do anyway. And they do it on some level, Maybe they partly do it for sort of cardiovascular exercise and live longer and all the rest of it, but they do on some level because doing it is the location of the fulfillment. So in a sense, I think you could probably say that anything you do where you appreciate that its value is partly in the doing of it is a sort of invitation to deep time. That is not the same as setting off on a hike or meditating or playing music or something and then bringing in the very self-conscious thought like, I am going to really immerse myself in the moment, because that has its own pitfalls. But it's knowing that you're not only doing it for its future purposes. It's not just like, filing your tax returns, which you just can't wait until it's finished, right? It's
and it's not a hack either, right? The thing that you just do just purely for its other benefit.
Yeah.
I wonder if the hiking's a good example as well, because it really grounds you in your body. Whereas I feel like so much of conveyor belt life kind of treats us like machines. And it's interesting because if that's how most of us are feeling, like dictated to by the clock, then we're being instrumentalized by something and it feels not as human as it might be. Whereas the deep time activities, so time before schedules, time before you needed to really do something for a particular outcome, feels like it just moves at a more human pace, really.
I think that's right. And I think the embodiment piece of this is really important. I'm not going to pretend that I feel like deeply literate in it. I think that's sort of the edge of my own explorations right now. But yeah, I think when we are in that situation of wanting to try to get control over time and wanting to feel like we have the efficiency to cope with the ever-increasing volume of things, the natural place to go is sort of left brain, intellectual concepts first. And what we're talking about here on some level is, right, the willingness to sort of be vulnerable to being in time. It's just like being here, not being able to know what the future holds, not being able to guarantee that you won't feel difficult emotions, all of that. And there's something, maybe it's culture specific partly, but there's something, isn't there, about sort of the retreat into the intellect that is what we naturally do to try to deal with that situation, because sort of the more embodied you are, the more, vulnerable to reality you are. But of course, also the more human and alive you get to be.
Well, I find that interesting because I believe, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that things like religion, things like art, things like mystery are very right-brained phenomena, poetry. And so have you got a very left-brained approach to religion? Or does your left brain bias you against that side of things, if I can put it that way?
It's interesting. I don't know how valid people take the left and right stuff to be these days. I know there's some very serious and respected work being done on it by sort of Ian McGilchrist and people. It's not all just pop self-help talk.
Yeah.
But, using it as a metaphor for now, or a framing device, in my life, I have been totally a sort of brain on a stick type person. That's my background. That's my sort of natural tendency. And I think a lot of what I'm writing about serves to try to integrate that tendency into something wider. I think in religious terms, it probably does help explain how naturally drawn I feel to kind of some Eastern religions, especially Zen Buddhism, I think has a flavor of taking left brainery and pushing it all the way it'll go until it sort of shudders and collapses, and then you're into something much more open. And I think sometimes, for example, koan study is an example of how that can be. Whereas certainly those aspects of Christian tradition that begin with love definitely feel a lot more right-brained, right? And so I consider people who sort of start from the necessary beliefs about that to be, I envy them on some level, right? It would be great to sort of begin from intuiting that kind of loving presence in the world, whereas I'm sort of constantly getting there through the distorting lenses of my own left brain bias. But I do think, it's not for lack of interest or for any idea that ultimately things like religion or faith or spirituality should be able to be put into a left brain container. It's like they clearly aren't, but I've got to work with the tools that I was raised with, I think.
This is Life and Faith, and you're listening to Justine's interview with author and productivity guru Oliver Burkeman about his book 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals. Back to the interview.
At several moments in your book, you are wrestling with, or you're talking about, that human yearning for more. our frustration with our finitude, and even this idea that we think we'll be satisfied when we finally mastered our time. But once we have mastered our time, we just find more things to feel dissatisfied about, and we just want more. I wanted to know, how do you make sense of that longing for immortality? Like, I'm not familiar with Zen Buddhism, and you've just mentioned it. Is there solace in there? Or is there a way of grappling with how to make sense of that immortality? Because, from my tradition, there is a sense that God has put eternity in our hearts, right? That longing for more is like an echo somewhat of what we were made for. And so that's how I sort of, I guess, make sense of that longing for more than one life, let's say.
Yeah.
I remember you saying just now that sometimes the afterlife almost lets people off the hook for doing something productive in the current time. And I think that can be true. But I wonder if also that knowledge that there is a bigger picture and a bigger story can help. We have some struggling efforts to get towards something in this life, but that's not the end of the story. And I just wondered how you make sense of that within your understanding of the world.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I've finished making sense of it by any means. But that's beautifully put in terms of your outlook and tradition there. And there's that very famous C.S. Lewis quotation, isn't there, from a letter he wrote that, the yearning for eternity is a clue on some level to being shaped for eternity. And I find that a very resonant notion. I suppose that in the kind of spiritual traditions that don't have a personal God at their center, it's more of a sense that if you can just sort of see past certain fixed ideas we have about our selfhood, then our eternity is just our belonging to everything, right? It's just there sort of entering the flow of the cosmos, stepping off the wheel of resurrection and being back to our true home in the whole universe. And to me, I would greatly welcome any challenges to this in this conversation or any other time. But to me, it seems that the personal God version of this sits on certain beliefs that I examine my mind and find that I don't have, right? It's not that I think some ridiculously superficial scientific analysis of them means that there's not enough evidence or something. It's just like that doesn't seem to be in me. So I think that's what leads me to the other kind of understanding of that yearning for eternity. But I think what both of those approaches, different kinds of religious approach, clearly avoid in a way that's very good, I think, is the implication you do sometimes get in secular writing about all this stuff, which is that there's just some sort of basic mistake in human constitution. And, you can go that way too, because if you take a very strict evolutionary approach, you might say, well, we've developed the ability to conceive of the infinite and eternity in certain ways, but it's just a byproduct of our evolving to do more basic, down-to-earth things that we've evolved to do. I find that hard to accept, but I suppose it's
me too.
I suppose it's the third option here, right? There's the sort of the Eastern and Western religious traditions, and then the sort of purely secular tradition. I don't find it convincing, but I don't necessarily say that I could rule it out. That yearning for eternity, I suppose, doesn't have to have, logic doesn't require that it has a reason. We might require that it have a reason.
No, I take that point. On what you were just saying in terms of how that longing for eternity has some kind of evolutionary imperative or something to it, it just made me think of like a beautiful cathedral, which probably took more than one human lifetime to build, and it is gesturing towards something much grander and bigger. And I was like, surely that's a bit extra if it's just an evolutionary adaptation. But anyway.
Well, I think if we just set our minds to it, I'm sure that we could come up with a semi-convincing evolutionary psychology explanation for cathedrals. But in a way, that's the problem, right? The fact that you can almost always come up with an evolutionary psychology argument is a pointer to the limits of evolutionary psychology, not proof that it's the only way to see things.
You are very pro-limits in the book, right? Obviously, because we all die. That's a deadline, if you want to put it that way. It's a limit. And yet, so much of our online life today, right, we are so anti-limit. I think the Netflix CEO says that the main competitor to Netflix is sleep. And I'm pretty sure we can open up infinite tabs on our browser. It may slow the computer down, but you can do that. And the internet doesn't turn off at any point. So if we're marinating in this online environment, which is about infinity in a way, like no limit, how can we be pro-limit in that kind of environment? Or is resistance futile?
It's interesting. I'm totally, of course, in some sense, I'm pro-limit. I think what I'm really doing is not saying we should live in a certain way, but just sort of pointing out that certain things are facts about us, right? So the limits that I harp on about are the limits that we just do have as humans, kind of whether we are conscious of them or not. And then, we step into these spaces. Absolutely, online is the classic example where the sort of phenomenology of it makes it very easy to feel unlimited in certain ways, disinhibited. But, you still are limited. And in fact, it's the fact that our attention, for example, is limited in these contexts that causes all the problems.
That's why we need the productivity hacks, right?
Right. The problems that we encounter are all to do with limited people being in those contexts that encourage or incentivize the feeling of not being limited. So whether you can sort of get past that problem by just being conscious of your limitations, I don't know if you can one can get all the way, but I think what I'm constantly trying to do is call attention to what the facts are, because that leads me to having more purchase in those spaces and to sort of integrating those technologies into my life in a more fruitful way that serves my real goals for my life. Because it's when for as long as you think you're not limited, that, that's when you make the poorest decisions about how to use your time. If you think that you're en route to getting to the point where you can handle everything, then each new demand that comes in, you sort of think, sure, I'll say yes to that, or I'll add that to the list, because who cares, right? It's an infinite list. Or you go online and you don't have any sort of awareness of the ways in which algorithmic social media is aiming to keep you there and cause you to make basically bad decisions about how you spend your time. So I think, making all of that conscious is the way to have a chance of thriving. I mean, in all my writing, I'm occasionally mentioning sort of specific tips and techniques, but the real thing is this perspective shift, because I think that's actually what's most practical.
You do make a case, though, for, I guess, social peer pressure, right? I mean, returning to the notion of Sabbath, the idea of a community putting... I don't want to say restrictions because we're so anti-limit in our culture, but, a community putting habits,
structures.
Let's say, structures, around time helps to sort of point our lives and ourselves in a different direction, I suppose. And it's really interesting because since 4,000 Weeks came out, you've got Jonathan Haidt also coming out with his Anxious Generation book and saying that, embodied practices of deep community are what's going to help address the kind of mental health crisis and our phone addiction and all the rest of it. But I'm wondering, in an age where, which has been described as post-Christian, or that religion, it feels like a really hard sell to kind of return to some kind of structured forms of community like that. How confident are you that we can kind of do this without the influence of that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know that I would say I'm calling for it. I think what I'm definitely trying to do in that section of the book is to sort of identify the ways in which that really helped when it was how we lived. It's not just that, it's good to have a day off each week. It's that when it's the same day off because of social norms or laws or anything else, that's when it's truly restful, because you don't need to worry that other people are still at work getting ahead of you on the promotional ladder. Right. You can plan to visit your friends on a Sunday afternoon or whatever, precisely because that's the day when they're not at their jobs or out shopping. And, as I hope I make clear as well, I think there are obviously many, many downsides to how that all manifested itself. And you've got to be sort of careful not to just endorse a kind of reactionary notion that back when everyone was more governed by tradition, it was better for us all, because it was large groups of people it wasn't better for at all. Those norms kind of were oppressive and discriminatory in all sorts of ways. But in that specific sense that they coordinated people's time, and they coordinated the notion that, like, at a certain point on a Friday evening or a Saturday evening, you put tools down and stopped, not because you'd finished everything, but just because that was when you did that, incredibly powerful. And they can't really be, if you decide as a family to have a digital Sabbath on a Saturday or a Sunday, it could work. And even a family is a social group that can exert a certain amount of peer pressure on each other, but it's going to be a lot harder, because you're going to have to persuade your teenagers to not be on social contexts online where all their friends are that day or all the time, whatever. I don't know what the answer is on the level of like social reform. Like, I suppose I could become a campaigner for more restrictive shop trading hours or something, and that would on some level be helpful. The important thing on an individual level, at any rate, is just to sort of be aware that this is how it works and how much easier it is when it's not all on your own shoulders. So in a very minor way, like joining any kind of association or club is an example of this, right? If you sing in a choir every Wednesday evening, as I used to do when we lived in New York, and I really miss it, and I need to get it back into my life somehow. To some degree, you're surrendering the control about when you do your singing in a choir and what you get to do with your Wednesday evenings, right? You're letting go of that because you know that what you get in return is worth it. And if you turned up to that empty church hall at like 3 p.m. on a Tuesday instead, it would be a terrible choir because it would just be me singing. And believe me, nobody wants to hear that. So that kind of, just in small ways, making commitments to those kinds of things makes a difference. I mean, I didn't plan it this way, but becoming a parent definitely had that effect as well in terms of placing me in communal rhythms that I don't really have much option but to be in, and that still cause me some like annoyance and tension when they don't go how I want them to go. But ultimately, I know that they're a good thing.
Are you talking about the Easter hat parade at daycare? What do you mean? Which communal rhythms?
Oh, no, I just mean in the life of, taking my son to school or picking my son up from school. The fact that, this week I'm going to a music recital at the school, right? These sort of things that I've sort of opted into without, I wasn't necessarily conscious that was what I was opting into, but having opted into them, I can tell that they're good for me.
Yeah. Parenthood is a blank check. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I did want to ask you about AI because 4,000 Weeks came out in 2021. And now anyone who's like a writer, like yourself, I don't want to assume that you feel this way about AI, but I certainly do, feel a little bit nervous that AGI is coming. And I certainly am starting to feel quite redundant because things like ChatGPT don't get tired. They don't need to be switched off like I need to be switched off at night when I go to sleep. So I wonder, because conveyor belt time made efficiency king, and now we've invented tools that, are far more efficient than we are, how does AGI kind of change the nature of creativity for us? Or are you hopeful that if AGI kind of takes away some of the more mundane activities, then maybe it'll help us zero in more on that humanness?
Yeah, I feel many, many things. And sometimes when I'm sort of reading other people's newsletters about it and stuff, I feel like I'm going crazy because it seems to me that like the way it gets talked about often seems to miss huge points. I mean, in terms of prognosticating about the future, my guess is as good as anybody's, really. I just think that the way to sort of begin with this is to understand what is valuable about human creativity. I mean, here's one way into it. I feel like a lot of people the arguments unfold online, for example, where someone says like, oh, an LLM will never write a novel as well as, Jane Austen. And then some AI bro responds like, this is just hopelessly naive. Of course they will. And frankly, probably already have done, right? You're just believing in some sort of magic fairy dust when you say that humans have something special. And I want to sort of say a plague on both your houses, because it seems to me that the important thing about a novel written by a human is not that it couldn't be approximated or exceeded on some technical level by a machine, but that it was written by a human. And that the things we're doing here and in a conversation like this, right, is two conscious sensibilities that experience emotions and have sentience are connecting to each other. And that's what's happening in human writing. And it isn't the same when there's no one there, which there effectively isn't in LLM generated text. And to make it vivid, right? Like if I were to discover at the end of this conversation that actually
I was an AI.
This image was a brilliant, based on all your previous videos and public stuff, perfect like emulation of you, which is not at all beyond the capacities of what exists, right? But if I were to learn that was what had actually happened here, of course the meaning of it would have radically reduced because there were not two humans having a conversation after all. And none of this should be taken as saying like, so therefore I'm totally confident there's always be a market for human creativity. Maybe there won't be, but I think it's critical to see that like that's the value here. And the sort of indefinable feeling of aliveness that exists in human encounters and that isn't there in an AI, quote, friendship or something, I think it's really important to keep our eyes on the ball in that respect. Absolutely doesn't mean that huge disruption won't be coming. I suppose it gives me some layer of optimism that might look hopelessly naive very quickly, but it makes me feel like I think I and you are doing things here that AI cannot do. And what that is to do with is being conscious and emoting and a sensibility. Again, maybe there's no market for that, but there's always changes in what there's a market for. It still is what is meaningful.
I did see a newspaper headline the other day where it was revealed that this radio host was an AI-generated host and no one knew for forever. So that's very disturbing. But I suppose the kind of attention we give a radio in the background versus a book that I'm reading, like when I was reading 4,000 Weeks last night or rereading it last night, it was a different quality of attention and I could really feel there was a human on the other end of these words, right?
Right.
So,
no, and sure, you know, maybe it's not going to make a difference to me if the instructions for my new dishwasher turns out to have been written by AI, unfortunately, because, technical writing is absolutely a profession or has been. So I don't mean like, oh, it's great news, no reason to worry, but I just want to insist on that distinction. People say very shortly AI will be able to do all the things that humans can do. And I'm like, well, it can't consciously write and it can't consciously research and it can't consciously draw images. So it can't really do any of the things that humans can do. It can do the unconscious equivalent of them. Unless you think the LLMs are conscious. And then, of course, you get into a whole different philosophical discussion that we probably shouldn't embark on.
Completely over my head in that area.
Well, there are the religious flavour that you get from the ways in which certain superficially totally secular atheist people at the forefront of the AI revolution, that is fascinating. Both the sort of apocalyptic side of things and the
we are building God sort of
right, the salvationary side of it, but also, it's like, the we are building God guys, exactly.
I did want to end on this cosmic insignificance therapy, which is that all of us, we live, we die, we're not going to leave a dent in the universe, basically. So we're not that special after all. But I wonder, that might very well be true, but then I'm pretty sure you don't feel like that about your son, for one thing. Or that even if you intellectually accept that that's really what's going on, you certainly don't live like that.
Yeah, there's sort of two parts to this. One is, and this is more when I brought it up in 4,000 Weeks, I think my intention was really to show that it can be very sort of therapeutic as a way of dealing with certain forms of stress and anxiety that come implicitly, although we don't usually recognize it, that come from an incredible grandiosity that we have about how significant we are or how significant our actions need to be. But looking at it, beyond that, I think that the point may be, and I don't even know if I got all the way there in 4,000 Weeks, sort of a little bit since then that some of this has come into focus for me. But the point is like, why does that have to be the criterion for meaning? So I want to both accept what seems to me intellectually clear, which is that lots of things about how I interact with my son may not matter to the cosmos in 2,000 years or 10,000 years' time, without thinking that means it doesn't deeply matter. And it deeply matters on a different criterion, which is it deeply matters now and deeply matters in the near future. And can't that be what mattering is? And in 4,000 Weeks, I talk about the work of the philosopher Ido Landau, who points out that, to set as our criterion of meaning, the idea that something should echo down the centuries or change everybody's lives on the planet or something, is just kind of, where does that come from? Why should that be the criterion? So why can't we be, in other words, cosmically insignificant and still, in some more important sense, have deeply meaningful lives? I guess that's the thought there.
Given that we've been talking about mortality, I wondered if, as a final comment, you wanted to venture any thoughts on how you would like your days to be remembered by those closest to you.
I think what it has to come down to ultimately is that I want to have shown up as fully as possible for life and to have created a situation in which more people can show up as fully as possible for life. It feels a bit evasive answering it in those terms, but I think that's what everything else collapses down into, right? So you can say, I would like to have been a good friend. I would have liked to have been a very attentive and present father and partner. You can say, I would have liked to do this or that through my writing or whatever. But I think it all comes down to, did I have a full experience of life, which is in some sense intrinsically connected to facilitating that in some other people as well?
Well, given we've been talking about how to best use your time, I think that's a lovely way to end the discussion. So thank you so much, Oliver.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it.
You've been listening to Life and Faith with me, Simon Smart, and Justine Toe.
Thank you especially to Oliver Burkeman for agreeing to be interviewed at very short notice. I'll put links to his website and also his books so you can find out more about his work.
And thanks to our producer, Alan Douthwaite. If you enjoyed this episode, please do send it on to someone else you think might benefit from it. I'm sure you can think of plenty of people. Or leave us a rating or review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps others find our work. Next time.
And lots of people who grew up with not even first-generation atheists, but second-generation atheists, whose grandparents even were secular, and they're coming to the world completely untouched by spirituality. And so, it's a very natural thing to want to explore deeper things in life and spirituality. So young people are very they have no gripes about engaging with religion, spirituality, esoteric thought.